The shimmering city lights might seem to swallow every secret, but some truths still wait for the day they will be revealed. Amidst the cold walls and honeyed words, Isabelle, a girl who once seemed to fade into the background, had quietly nurtured her own strength. This story is not just a family tragedy. It is a triumphant anthem of pride and rebirth. When everything she once believed in crumbled, Isabelle found the most precious thing of all: the freedom and the voice that no one could ever take from her. Watch this story where every word, every glance can become a weapon, and where courage is the one thing that can never be buried. Do you know the feeling when at last everything falls into place, when every bit of effort from long, endless years is finally rewarded? That was exactly how Isabelle felt as she stood in the middle of her new apartment, her eyes sparkling in the warm yellow glow of the simple yet elegant ceiling light. After 6 years of tireless work, sacrificing every luxury, every paycheck meticulously saved and funneled into a single savings account that only she knew about. And now it had all come to life: a two-bedroom apartment in Central Heights. Not too big, not too small, but just right. Just like the dream she had always carried. She didn't have to borrow, didn't have to rely on anyone, every inch of it built by her own hands. Standing in the small living room flooded with sunlight, she allowed herself a gentle smile, a smile that was quiet, but full of pride, and she couldn't help but take out her phone, snapping hundreds of pictures, sharing them on social media, as if to declare to the world, Isabelle did it. The comments of congratulations flooded in, everyone admiring, everyone praising her for living the dream. And in that moment, Isabelle truly believed she had finally claimed what she deserved. But then the phone rang, and the name Dad George appeared on the screen. In a single instant, every painful memory she thought had long been put to rest rose up again, and Isabelle knew that her dream life was about to be confronted by the old nightmare called family. When the phone stopped ringing and the screen went dark, Isabelle shivered slightly, as if for a fleeting moment the warm glow of her new apartment had been covered in a cold, creeping fog. She slowly set the phone down on the kitchen table, letting it lie still, then leaned against the cool surface, forcing her breath to steady. Memories flooded in, so vivid she could almost smell the mustiness of the dark corners of the old house, a place that had once been home but had never truly been a sanctuary. Back then, when Isabelle was just a 9-year-old girl, her mother's jet-black hair began to fall out in handfuls, her face growing pale and hollow from nights spent fighting the pain. Cancer took her mother away, and with it the peaceful world Isabelle had once believed would last forever. At the funeral, she stood beside the casket covered in white chrysanthemums, her small hand gripping her father's, desperate for him to hold her, to offer a word of comfort. But George only squeezed her hand briefly, then turned away, his eyes fixed on the blonde woman across the crowd, Vivian, who had entered their lives just months after her mother's grave had yet to turn green with grass. The days that followed were a blur of changes that left Isabelle breathless. Vivian moved in just a year after her mother died, and it didn't take long for her to transform the old familiar house into her own stage. The pale green living room walls her mother had loved were painted a cold beige. A brand new sofa flaunted its pristine luxury, and the family photos, those that showed Isabelle's beaming smile beside her mother, were taken down, tucked away into a box she would never see again. Vivian's voice was as sweet as honey when there were guests, but behind closed doors it turned sharp as a knife. Isabelle learned to walk softly, to speak in whispers, just to exist, without drawing any trouble. Then Emily was born, and Isabelle realized she had become a shadow in her own home. Emily, with her chubby cheeks and clear blue eyes, was the pride of George and Vivian. They planned every one of Emily's birthdays, chose the best schools, bought her every toy she could name. Isabelle, by then a thin, withdrawn teenager, learned to retreat to the corners of her room, her only comfort the quiet hours she spent with Martha, the one person who still saw her as a child in need of love. Martha lived in a small riverside cottage on the outskirts of Central Heights, her home always scented with apple pie and the sounds of classical music wafting from an old radio. It was Isabel's sanctuary, where she wasn't the thorn in anyone's side, where she didn't have to hear the constant refrain, "Isabel, you must understand, Emily is still young." But it didn't stop there. As she entered her teenage years, Isabel felt the harshness of that family divide more keenly than ever. She was never allowed a room that was truly hers. Her space was always the spare room, the one for unexpected guests, for Vivian's visiting friends, while Emily had an entire dressing room filled with glittering dresses. Every time she spoke up, George would only bow his head, never meeting her eyes. Vivian would smile with patronizing sympathy. "Isabel, you have to understand. Emily needs space to grow. You're older now. You have to make way for her." Isabel learned to press down her anger, to turn it into a resolve to leave as soon as she could. And so Martha became Isabel's only refuge. She opened her arms, welcoming her whenever the cold words at home left her gasping for breath. Together they baked planted flowers and talked late into the night. "You're Isabel, and you have the right to live, to be happy," Martha once said, her blue eyes bright with faith. Those words were rare gifts that touched Isabel's heart, and she carried them with her through the years. When Isabel was accepted to college in Aurora City, it was Martha who hugged her first, pressing an envelope into her hand. "Use it for the hard days." "I'm always here," she said. George only sighed. "If you leave, who will look after Emily?" The question struck like a slap, but Isabel had no more tears left. She left carrying Martha's silent blessing and a promise to never return empty-handed. Throughout 4 years of college, Isabel worked tirelessly, studying and saving every penny. On graduation day, she sent Martha a handmade card telling her she had found her first job, small, but enough to stand on her own. George didn't call. Vivian didn't message. Emily didn't ask. Isabel told herself it was all right. So long as Martha was there, she still had a place to belong. But when Martha died suddenly from a stroke, Isabel knew she had lost her final haven. In her will, Martha left her $150,000, the lifetime savings of a woman who believed that a girl with her mother's heart deserved a chance. It was the last thread connecting Isabel to unconditional love, and it became the springboard for her to begin again. Today, standing in her new apartment built with her own hands and quiet sacrifices, Isabel closed her eyes, letting the memories rush in. The scent of Martha's apple pies seemed to linger in the air, chasing away the mildew of the old house, and Vivian's icy voice. But the phone's ring still echoed in her mind like an omen, a reminder that family was still out there, ready to pull her back into the darkness. And this time, Isabel silently vowed she would never let them bury her again. Isabel never forgot those late afternoons spent pedaling her bike down the cobbled road that led to Martha's house, a small cottage tucked beside the river where the wind always whistled through old window frames, and the scent of baked apples wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Martha would greet Isabel with gentle arms and blue eyes that seemed to see every bit of loneliness she had carried inside for so many years. There, Isabel was allowed to be herself, no longer the overlooked stepchild, no longer the one who had to give way to everything for Emily. Together they watered the white chrysanthemums that Martha loved, brewed hot tea, and giggled when cookies in the oven burned to a crisp. It was a tiny, perfect world where Isabel didn't have to fear George's heavy steps or Vivian's watchful stare. In that haven, she found the warmth of a family, a love that the cold walls of her real house had never made room for. It was in that place that Isabel decided she would never let her life be caged by the twisted expectations of others. While Emily grew up pampered, every dinner, a performance, every holiday, a lavish affair, Isabel learned to stand on her own 2 feet. She didn't have sparkling dresses like her sister, or fawning compliments, or extravagant birthday parties. What she had were long nights buried in books, early mornings working odd jobs, and coins carefully saved in a worn-out wallet. Martha never asked Isabel why she always seemed to endure in silence, or why she had never fought back. She would simply look at her with those kind, wise eyes and say, "You don't have to prove your worth to anyone. Don't let them force you into a mold they made for you." That was the message Isabel carried with her through all the years that followed. Martha became the only anchor she had, the only one who saw the wounds Isabel hid behind her quiet, polite smile. When Isabel received her college acceptance letter, it was Martha who hugged her first, her thin but warm hands resting on Isabel's shoulder. "You've come so far, Isabel," she said, her voice soft as a breeze, but filled with a lifetime of love. George, on the other hand, just said brusquely, "If you leave, who'll take care of Emily?" as if that was the only thing that mattered. Vivian stood behind him, eyes narrowing slightly, her hand resting on Emily's shoulder, like a seal on the perfect child's place in the family. For Isabel, college was the first time she ever tasted true freedom, the first time she could breathe, without fear of judgment. She found friends who shared her loneliness, found afternoons spent in sunlit libraries, found the small dreams she kept for herself. But above all, she found herself a girl who didn't need anyone's approval to hold her head high. Even away from home, Isabel still called Martha every night, telling her about little things: the first meal she cooked by herself, her job at the coffee shop, or just the joy of autumn coming and the golden leaves covering the paths. Martha always listened, patient and warm, laughing softly when Isabel told her stories in that breathless, excited voice. Those calls kept her safe from the ache of missing a home she knew had never been hers. But when Martha died suddenly, Isabel felt like she was being pulled under by an invisible current. The news didn't come in a loving call, it arrived in a cold letter from the lawyer handling the estate. She remembered that last night, hearing Martha's voice, still gentle, still full of hope, never realizing it would be their last goodbye. In her will, Martha left Isabel $150,000, the lifetime savings she had carefully hoarded, a final promise: "You must live for yourself." Now, standing in her new Central Heights apartment, the lamplight shining off the white walls that still smelled of fresh paint, Isabel closed her eyes and felt her heart thudding in her chest. She knew that all of this was never about proving anything to George or Vivian. It was about saying to herself she was no longer that frightened little girl in the shadows. Isabel had broken free of the ghosts of her past, and she would never let anyone drag her back into them again. The day Martha died, Isabel sat alone in the small rented room of a strange city, the night pouring in through the cold window as her chest tightened painfully. That warm, steady voice was gone. There would be no more quiet afternoons by the hearth listening to Martha's stories, only a hollow ache, and one final gift: $150,000 that Martha had saved her entire life for the granddaughter with her mother's heart. Isabel knew Martha hadn't left her that inheritance out of duty or to make up for the years she'd grown up without a mother. It was the legacy of love, the trust she had placed in her, saying Isabel deserved a life of her own, a home no longer smelling of mildew and stifled tears. That money, what many might see as a chance for a new life, was for Isabel far more than a ticket out of cramped rented rooms. It was a symbol of all Martha's quiet sacrifices, the unconditional faith she had never gotten from her father. And Isabel decided to make it the foundation for the dream she had carried ever since she sat on Martha's wooden steps nibbling apple pie, and imagining a warm space no one could force her to be silent in. The small apartment in Central Heights with 2 bedrooms, windows welcoming the sunrise and wooden floors that smelled of freedom was Isabel's choice. Not some flashy penthouse or a perfect old house, but a place that balanced peace with her own hard-won pride. When she signed the deed, her hand trembled a little, but her eyes shone as bright as the morning light, streaming through the living room curtains. She had done it on her own, without leaning on anyone, no longer the shadow in George and Vivian's house. The day she got the keys, Isabel spent the entire afternoon arranging every little thing. The gray rug she'd chosen herself, The soft beige armchair she had saved 3 months of paychecks to buy each one declared the same thing: Isabelle had the right to decide, the right to lift her head and call this place home. She snapped photos to share with the friends who had always stood by her, people who never asked, "What about Emily?" or "Why buy something that's too much for you?" Only, "Are you happy?" And she smiled, a small smile, but full of the power of someone who had broken through the invisible walls of a family that only knew how to bind. That evening, Isabelle brewed a cup of hot tea, set it on the windowsill, and watched the city light up. In her heart was a peace she had never known before, the feeling of finally belonging somewhere, of having a home no one could just claim away. But just as the street lamp cast her shadow on the freshly painted white wall, the phone rang. Seeing the word "Dad" glowing on the screen, Isabelle shivered. She knew this piece had only just begun, but the old nightmare still wasn't ready to let her go. Isabelle took a deep breath, her resolve rising like a hidden tide. Whatever lay behind that call, she would not back down. Her home, her dream, would never again be something anyone could bargain for. George's call unfolded like a play he'd rehearsed for years, his voice still holding that dry, lifeless tone Isabelle had known throughout her childhood. "Isabelle, Emily needs a place to stay while she's in college." He began, no greeting, no acknowledgement of her new apartment or her achievement. Isabelle listened silently, her hand tightening around the handle of her teacup as she fought down the anger rising in her chest. George continued, his tone that of a man bestowing a favor. "Your apartment? It's perfect. Great location, convenient, close to Emily's school. You should let her have it. You don't need a two-bedroom place all to yourself." Isabelle didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch on like a dull blade, every second cutting into his patience. Finally, she simply asked, "What exactly do you mean by 'let her have it'?" The question wasn't just for clarification, it was a challenge. On the other end of the line, George sighed heavily, then adopted that patronizing, lecturing tone he had used so many times. "Isabelle, don't be selfish. Emily is your sister. She's preparing for her future. Living alone in that two-bedroom apartment, don't you think that's a waste?" Isabelle felt her chest tighten, but her voice stayed steady and cold. "I bought that apartment. It's mine. I don't owe Emily anything." But George wouldn't let her finish, cutting her off with a voice that sank low like a threat. "Isabelle, don't forget. That money for the apartment came from Martha. It's not really yours. Don't make me disappointed." That word, disappointed, stabbed at Isabelle's memory, calling up all the times she had swallowed her pride just to please a man who had never truly seen her. But this time, she was no longer the small, meek girl cowering in the corner. Isabelle lifted her chin, letting her silence speak louder than any words. And when she finally said, "There's nothing for me to give up, Dad," she realized it wasn't just an answer. It was a declaration. No one had the right to take what she had built with her own sweat. No one could force her to give up what she had fought so hard to create. The call ended with a cold click, but the air in Isabelle's apartment felt warmer than it ever had. She set the phone down, exhaled deeply, and felt her heart no longer trembling. The light from the window cast her shadow on the white walls, showing her alone, but proud no longer, the shadowy figure beneath her father and stepmother's feet. This apartment, every brick, every wall, every stroke of paint, it was proof that Isabelle had claimed a new life for herself. And she vowed that no one, not even family, would ever lay a hand on it again. 1 week after that tense phone call, as Isabelle was savoring her morning coffee and enjoying the calm of her own apartment, the doorbell suddenly rang, a jarring sound that cut through the quiet. When she opened the door, she saw Henry, her cousin, his face unusually serious. "Isabelle, you need to see this," he whispered, his voice low but urgent, as if he was holding something that could change everything. Henry pulled her into the hallway, unlocked his phone, and showed her a series of photos. Each image was like a small knife slicing through the veil of deception George and Vivian had worked so hard to keep in place. Vivian, the stepmother who had always appeared composed and devoted, was sitting in a cozy bar with a stranger, Martin Cooper. These weren't the accidental brushes of friends or the distant gazes of polite acquaintances. They were laughing hands, clasped eyes, locked in a way that left no doubt. Isabel's heart pounded as she scanned each photo Henry showed her. Questions pounded through her mind. How long? How long had Vivian been deceiving her father? And then a bigger question crashed over her. If Martin was the man in Vivian's life, was Emily the sister, everyone expected her to make room for truly George's child. That thought flickered like a flash of light in the darkness, illuminating a truth Isabelle had only vaguely dared to sense. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady and somber. "You need to know this, Isabelle," he said, his voice catching. "Vivian and Martin have been together for years. They're not even careful around those willing to see. I've seen them many times, but now I'm sure you can't let them take what's yours, Isabelle." Isabelle didn't say anything, only nodded silently. In that moment, she knew there was no turning back. That night, Isabelle barely slept. She went through every old photo, every deleted message, every sweet-laced lie Vivian had whispered to keep her quiet. It all suddenly became pieces of a dark puzzle, a family pretending to be whole, but in truth, just a stage set for deceit. Isabelle felt like she was standing at a crossroads. She could either let them trample her pride again, or she could cross the line and search for the truth buried beneath the perfect facade of family. And Isabelle knew her choice. The next day, she quietly gathered a few strands of George's hair, the comb he used still there in the old house. She was careful, her hands trembling slightly, but her gaze was unshaken. Then she found a way to get some of Emily's hair from her perfect sister's hairbrush. When it was done, Isabelle stared at the two small Ziploc bags holding those strands of hair, a strange calm washing over her. She knew she was about to reach for a truth that might tear everything apart. But she wasn't afraid, because now Isabelle understood the truth, no matter how cruel, was worth more than any carefully crafted lie, and she was ready to face it. That morning, the early sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a pale yellow glow on the strands of hair glinting in the two small Ziploc bags. Isabelle carefully placed them in an envelope, wrote her name, address, and the request for a DNA test on the label. On the way to the lab, she felt a calm that surprised her, as if all her fears had burned away during that sleepless night of silent thoughts. The DNA testing center was small and bright, its walls adorned with posters boasting promises of truth and trust. Isabelle sat waiting, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the file folder, as if she wanted to feel every grain of paper. Each line of ink was a turning point she could not turn away from. When the technician asked if she was sure about submitting the samples, Isabelle nodded without hesitation. "I've waited long enough for this truth," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. And as the envelope disappeared behind the small glass window, Isabelle took a deep breath, as though she was finally daring to fill her lungs completely. The days waiting for the results were days when Isabelle challenged herself not to be afraid. Each morning she brewed a cup of hot tea, tidied her apartment, and quietly breathed in the scent of lavender from the white porcelain jar. At night she sat by the window watching the streetlights glow, thinking of her mother, the woman who had given her not just the soft black hair, but also the fierce heart. She didn't know how painful the truth would be, but she knew she would not turn away from it. Then one afternoon, the envelope from the testing center appeared in her mailbox, a plain white envelope marked only with her name and the embossed seal of the laboratory. Isabelle's hands trembled slightly as she tore it open, the paper inside, rustling like it was whispering a secret. The first line hit her like a blade, cold and final. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. George was not Emily's biological father. Probability of paternity 0%. Isabelle sat frozen in the armchair, the fading daylight casting those words in stark relief, a final blow to every tender memory that had ever existed. All the unanswered questions of the past about favoritism, about George's blind love for Emily, now had a cold, undeniable answer. She drew a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the paper as though she was gripping her own destiny. That night, Isabelle didn't cry. No tears fell, only a numb calm settling over her. She knew this wasn't just a test result. It was the end of a lie that had strangled her for so many years, and it was the beginning of a truth, one Isabelle would no longer fear to speak. She stood up carefully, folded the paper, and placed it in her wallet next to her ID card, a new milestone in a life she was now writing word by word with her own voice and her own unshakable pride. When Isabelle stepped through George's doorway that evening, the air was so heavy it felt as if every wall in the house already knew what was about to happen. Vivian sat in her favorite armchair, arms folded like a queen, waiting for her prodigal child to return in shame, while George sat silently by the fireplace, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Emily sat next to her mother, fiddling with her phone, pretending none of this concerned her. Isabelle entered calm and steady, but her eyes burned with determination, and she knew none of them could have guessed what she was about to bring. "You wanted to talk? Then let's speak plainly," Isabelle began, her voice calm but cutting across the table like a blade. George faltered, his eyes flickering with uncertainty for just a moment. "Isabelle, it's time you thought about the family," he began. But Isabelle cut him off, her voice firm and unwavering. "Family? Then you should take a good look at this first." She set the white envelope with the DNA test results on the table softly but decisively, as if laying down the final punctuation in a tragedy that had run far too long. For a moment, the air in the room turned so thick it was hard to breathe, as George's trembling hands opened the envelope. Each word printed on the page seemed to leap out at him. "The alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested child." He stammered, his face going pale, hands shaking violently. Vivian jumped up, her face blanching before she quickly tried to hide it behind the familiar practiced mask. That's a lie. Isabelle, you're trying to destroy this family," she shrieked, repeating the cheap drama she had played for years. But Isabelle stood tall, calmly pulling out her phone and scrolling to the photo of Vivian and Martin Cooper in that cozy bar, arms wrapped around each other. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, her voice quiet but each word striking like the blow of a hammer. Emily, who had kept her face buried in her phone until now, looked up, her perfect face, suddenly drained of color, eyes wide with shock. George sat stunned, his lips moving soundlessly. Vivian's face had gone white, her hands twisting on the arm of the chair, knowing that any denial now would be pointless. "Emily is not my sister, and Martin Cooper's daughter has no right to claim my apartment," Isabelle said slowly, each word as sharp and precise as a blade. The room was so silent Isabelle could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. And in that moment she knew all of the lies, all of Vivian and George's manipulations had finally collapsed. Nothing could hide the truth any longer. Isabelle took a deep breath, tucked the DNA results and the photos back into her bag, and turned to leave. Her shoulders no longer bent. She was no longer the girl standing on the sidelines to be trampled by others. Her apartment, her life, no one could take that from her. And as she walked out of that heavy door, Isabelle knew she was truly free. A week after that night, when all the lies fell apart, Isabelle sat in a small cafe on the corner of Central Heights. Pale yellow sunlight streaming through the glass window, making her hair glow with soft light. The phone lay on the table before her, and when the screen lit up with the word "Dad" clear as day, she looked at it, wringing her heart, no longer gripped by fear. Finally she answered, and her father's voice came through, deep and weary, stripped of the usual pride and coldness. "Isabelle, I was wrong. I didn't know. I didn't know how you lived all these years. I can't change the past, but I want you to know if you can. Please give me a chance to make it right." Isabelle closed her eyes, listening to the heavy breathing on the other end of the line. She didn't speak right away, the old wounds still tender and raw from years of being forgotten, of being trampled under the name of family. But now she understood forgiveness isn't about forgetting or returning to an old place. Forgiveness is about setting yourself free. I'm willing to listen, but I'm not making any promises. Isabelle said, her voice calm like a lake after a storm. George fell silent for a moment, then quietly said, I understand. They met at that same cafe, no more performances, no more rehearsed lines. George looked so much older, his hair touched with gray, his face worn by the years that had passed. He told Isabelle stories he had never shared before, nights he spent awake while her mother lay dying, moments of cowardice when he turned away, as Vivian's cold smile loomed large. Isabelle sat silently listening, but not crying, because she knew that in the end no apology could bring justice for the past. It was up to her, Isabelle, to decide where her life would go from there. 3 months later, they still met, sometimes just for brief lunches, a few questions about work, about the apartment Isabelle had built with her own 2 hands. Isabelle wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive, or if she was simply learning to live with the fractured pieces that remained. But she knew that for the first time in so many years, she was being seen as a person, no longer the daughter who had to sacrifice, no longer Emily's shadow, but Isabelle, with her own voice and her own quiet hunger for life. As for Vivian and Emily, rumors traveled faster than any apology letter. They had left the city, gone to live with Martin Cooper, a new family built on the foundation of lies that Isabelle no longer cared about. She smiled whenever she thought of it, because in the end, those who had built that false play had found where they belonged, and it was no longer her place. In the late afternoon, Isabelle returned to her apartment. She stood on the balcony watching the streetlights blaze bright in the night, her chest swelling with a new kind of faith that everything she had endured, the patience, the tears, the sleepless nights, had led her here to this moment. Alone, but no longer lonely. Because Isabelle knew she had found something more precious than any inheritance, the right to live as herself, no longer caged by anyone or anything. And to her, that was the greatest gift of all, the gift of freedom and pride that no one could ever take away. Isabelle's journey ended not with regret or tears, but with an unshakable faith in herself. As those who had once belittled her left and the lights of her apartment burned bright in the night, Isabelle knew no one but herself could decide where her life would go. If you've ever had to fight for what's rightfully yours, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring more stories of pride, freedom, and the true worth of every human being. Let this journey inspire you and all of us.